Everyone, we are now entering into the last phase of microbiology lecture. We're going to be going through the chapters that are covering diseases, and they're broken down by body area. This approach is most familiar to most of you that are in the health sciences because these systems will most likely be the focus of your courses. Now, we're going to cover it by chapter, and to start, chapter 19 is all about the skin. As we're moving through these chapters, I want to direct you on how you should probably prepare to study for this. I highly recommend you make yourself a study table that will help you as you're reviewing for the exam. In the study table, you should include the name of the disease or condition that we're covering, the organism name that's causing the disease, in other words, the etiologic agent, and the type it is. Is it a protozoa, a fungus, a virus? Is it a gram-positive coccus? Is it a gram-negative enteric? How is it transmitted or acquired? Is it a respiratory or ingestion? Is it the bite of a particular biological vector? And finally, the major signs and symptoms or characteristics of the disease. I'm talking about something that helps you diagnose the disease, that makes it stand out from the others. Not common things like a headache or the feeling of malaise. Those are symptoms that are common in too many diseases, and they're not distinguishing. So pay attention to these pieces of information. Those are the pieces of information that questions will be asking about in the future. You want to try to highlight and narrow down for your studying the things to review as you're going through. Now that I've given you a heads up, I'm going to start with chapter 19, which is all about the organisms that cause problems on the skin. You'll have a couple of lectures for chapter 19. Keep in mind that our skin is colonized with a lot of different microorganisms, including some yeast. You don't have to remember the name for the yeast. Now you do want to remember the bacterium Staphylococcus because staph causes various skin problems that we're going to be talking about in this chapter. We also have things like Micrococcus, which you might remember working with in the lab, and organisms called diphtheroids, which we'll discuss further. And they can transform to become disease-causing, like diphtheria. But we'll revisit that in the respiratory section. So, any of these can produce disease if the epidermis layer of the skin is compromised or if your immune system is suppressed. The beginning of chapter 19 does review some of the basic anatomy of skin, so if you want to review that, please do. We will start with probably the most benign and the least problematic type of infection of the skin, folliculitis, which is the medical term for a pimple. When you get an infection of the hair follicle, it develops into a pimple. If it's on the eye or the base of the eyelid, then it's called a stye, but this is the same basic process. This can spread to something a little more severe called a furuncle, also known as a boil. With a boil, we're talking about several hair follicles involved. That's something a little larger and usually more painful. Carbuncles are even larger and more dangerous, encompassing a larger area of the skin. Often, these have to be surgically debrided, where the infected tissue is removed in an attempt to allow the skin to try to repair. So carbuncles are quite severe. Mostly, these are caused by staph, and the two species of Staphylococcus that are found on the skin are Staphylococcus epidermidis and Staphylococcus aureus. As you'll see as we move through these chapters, Staph aureus pops up far more frequently and causes a lot more serious infections than Staph epidermidis, but Staph epidermidis can sometimes cause a problem. Antimicrobials are possible to treat them. You don't need to remember the names of these antimicrobials, but you might recognize vancomycin. It does pop up quite a bit because it's one of the last lines of defense for Staph aureus types of infections. This is a table from your book that you might want to glance over because what it's talking about is the different conditions that Staph aureus can cause. Remember, the staph is coming from your skin. It might be in your nares, right, your nostrils, or from other people's skin or nostrils. When we're looking at the two species of Staphylococcus that do appear in your skin, you can see that Staph aureus has a lot more virulence factors, and that explains why it causes more disease. Remember that we talked about coagulase earlier when we talked about virulence factors. It's that enzyme that can coagulate plasma, causing a little clot and allowing Staph aureus to hide out and multiply without being faced with the immune response. Then the kinase allows it to break out of that clot and spread. So that's a pretty important factor. Also, there are other toxins that they can have that can cause problems. Staph epidermidis, on the other hand, has far fewer virulence factors and so often is not involved in these infections. Let's talk about scalded skin syndrome. As you can see here, an individual that is infected looks like they have experienced a burn, but a toxin is causing the effect. The toxin is Staphylococcus scalded skin syndrome toxin, or SSST. These toxins will cause the skin layers to separate from each other by basically breaking the bonds between the layers of the skin. Usually, the person can recover from this and there'll be no scarring, but if you get a secondary infection, then you may get a scar because the other organism is causing other types of damage in the skin. Death is rare, but when it happens is usually, again, caused by secondary infections. Note that not all Staph aureus strains have this toxin. It's only the ones that possess the genes for the toxin that can cause this infection. You often see this in very young infants or in immunocompromised individuals, and again, it's transmitted person-to-person spread of the organism that contains the toxin that can cause the particular type of infection. Moving on, we're going to talk about a different infection that can either be caused by Staph aureus or even more commonly by a Streptococcus pyogenes. This organism, Strep pyogenes, will also pop up quite frequently with infections as it's somewhat versatile gram-positive cocci pathogen, as is Staph aureus. Streptococcus pyogenes is also known as Group A strep. And if you might remember us talking about this organism when we discussed the immunochromatography, because it does cause strep throat. And they do an immunochromatography test, a rapid diagnostic test for that. Strep pyogenes will invade where skin is compromised. I do not know if the infected, crusty-looking ear looks familiar to anyone, but this is a fairly common infection called impetigo, caused by either Staph aureus or Group A strep. This infection is contagious, and as you can see, it happens in elderly patients, but also in young children, often in daycare. It tends to spread around because it itches, and an individual, a kid, scratches and then touches other things and spreads the organism around. Erysipelas often looks like this photo here, where there is a lot of reddening on the face and it starts to swell. Without treatment, it can be fatal 2 to 17% of the time. Erysipelas often occurs in elderly patients. Now, to put this in context, think about that in relation to COVID-19, which has a fatality rate of less than 1%. So that's actually quite a high fatality rate with this infection if you don't treat it with antimicrobials to protect the individual. It's not nearly as contagious as the virus SARS-CoV-2, but it is more deadly. Both of these are skin infections. Impetigo is not fatal, but erysipelas might be. Moving on to infections that are commonly caused by strep pyogenes. This one is quite dangerous and can have quite a high mortality rate even if you're treating it. Necrotizing fasciitis is a Group A strep infection that is moving through the connective tissue layers of the skin, causing rampant destruction. It is known commonly as flesh-eating disease and galloping gangrene for the rapidity of the spread. This organism destroys the connective tissue and rapidly is moving through the tissues, killing cells and causing lots of damage due to the virulence factors it possesses, such as destructive enzymes and toxins that it produces. There's a whole insert inside of your textbook shown on this next slide It goes through the details of how this organism causes this terrible infection. Necrotizing fasciitis can be caused by some other organisms, but it's often caused by Streptococcus pyogenes, and it's a very dangerous problem when it does occur. In hospitals, what they'll do if someone comes in with an intense red painful lesion is that they'll demarcate, or in other words, encircle the lesion with a Sharpie marker as soon as the person comes in. Then they watch over the next hours to see if the lesion spreads outside of that mark, because it's a definite sign of necrotizing fasciitis, a red lesion spreading rapidly. Again, this is a very dangerous infection, so much so that often the only possible treatment is to amputate to stop the spread of the damaging infection. This is the insert from your textbook, so you might want to open to chapter 19 and find this and read about some of the virulence factors like protein M that helps it attach and streptolysin S that's so dangerous and damaging. I'm not going to ask a lot of detail about virulence factors, but you should know about the organism and this particular condition since it's a very scary condition if you come across it. All right, now I'm going to say a little word about acne. It's caused by an organism that lives on your skin, Propionibacterium acnes. It's a gram-positive organism. You can see acne on people that have more oily skin, often in the teen years. In short, you get an infection of the hair follicle, specifically around the sebaceous glands, that causes inflammation and pustule formation. You should know that it's caused by an organism that normally lives on your skin, and when the conditions are right, it's able to cause the infection. This next infection is not just a skin infection, but it is visible on the skin. This infection gets into the lymph nodes and then moves more systemic. You can see this very inflamed, extremely painful lymph node. It's called a bubo, which characterizes the disease. Cat scratch fever, caused by Bartonella henselae, was one of the organisms that came up in the list if you did the Bacterial ID virtual lab for extra credit. As the disease name suggests, cats can transmit the infection to humans. It's not an organism that can be cultured, so you cannot grow it in the lab. That means for detection or diagnosis, it must be made by some other mechanism, like a PCR type of reaction, or via serological tests looking for antibodies against this bacterium. These swellings can last a really long time. You can go into shock if the infection is not treated. In this disease, the malaise, or the not feeling very well feeling, is common, but that's not diagnostic. This bubo is a diagnostic sign of the disease, and it is, as I mentioned, often transmitted by cat bites or scratches. The infection is usually seen in kids who often play around with cats and get bitten or scratched, but it's not limited to kids. Adults can be affected too. And it is treatable in both cases if the diagnosis is made. One last disease to talk about in this presentation, this opportunistic infection by Pseudomonas aeruginosa, an organism that is found in the environment. You find it in the soil and in decaying matter. It is something that you can't really avoid coming in contact with. If a patient has a severe burn, they're at extreme risk for this infection. You can see the piocyanin, which is that blue-green pigment on this patient, because the burns are infected. This is not a good state for the patient. This organism is naturally very resistant to antimicrobials, so it's very difficult to treat. There are usually not very many good options to treat the infection. This opportunistic infection by Pseudomonas aeruginosa is a very dangerous condition, and it can trigger shock and death. Because it's opportunistic, it's one of the organisms that can cause severe problems in burn patients, as shown here. It can cause problems in other patients, such as cystic fibrosis patients, but that'd be covered in chapter on respiratory infections. Pseudomonas aeruginosa is an organism that people in the ICU worry about. It's present in the environment and resistant naturally to many antimicrobials and is opportunistic. This is one of the reasons you can't bring things like cut flowers into the ICU, because this organism is definitely going to be present on such items, so they don't allow them in. All right, we'll stop this video here. Catch you in the next lecture.